Stay hungry, stay foolish.
So now on the Innovation Show, we welcome Andrew Pinnington, CEO of Hailo. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
That's great. Thank you for welcoming us here in your beautiful office in Somerset House in London. We'll get straight into it because before we talk about Hailo and the merger with MyTaxi, it'd be great to hear about you a bit because you've had a deep career in Pepsi, in Carrefour and Warehouse, and to hear a little bit about that would be great.
Yeah, so I guess you just picked out the highlights. So started my life at Bain, the consulting company Bain, and then went from there to the US to do an MBA, and out of that ended up working in the US with Pepsi. Stayed over there a total of nearly 8 years. Then came back and got on the very fast-moving train that was Carrefour and Warehouse when it was still quite small. So had a dozen years there through a pretty astronomical growth curve where we used to call them car phone years, where 1 year felt like it was 7 years worth of experience because so much change and dynamism was taking place. And then at the end of that, I basically transitioned into this role at Hailo, which has been a fascinating couple of years, and that's culminated in this new merger with MyTaxi. So yeah, my role will be and title will be changing to CEO of MyTaxi shortly.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting move, and one that you didn't know about when you came in, which is even more interesting for you, that you've kind of overseen this. And it's a great, I personally think it's a great play. It's something that makes total sense where a car company goes into this world, because in the future of driverless cars, it makes total sense that you own the distribution, because if that was owned by somebody else, you're in a weaker position. Can we talk about that a little bit? And
yeah, of course. I mean, I think there are two rationales behind the deal. One which is very specific to the two companies concerned, so the two operating entities, and one which, as you referred to there, is a more strategic one, which is the sort of the auto manufacturer interest in the business. So maybe if I just take each of those in turn. I mean, for the two operating entities, Hailo and MyTaxi, both operating in the same space, in a very similar way with the licensed taxi market, so e-hailing within the licensed taxi market. But we had very, very complementary geographies. And Hailo is effectively in UK, Ireland and Spain. And MyTaxi exists in five other markets in addition to Spain. And Spain was only our only overlap. And so by putting the two businesses together, there's great financial synergies, but also just geographic synergies that mean that we are now, we just opened another market, so we're in a total of nine EU markets that instantly make us the number one player in the space. So for the two companies, there was a lot of good rationale behind it. But the new organization will be owned 60% by Daimler and 40% by the Hailo shareholders. And I think there's been a lot of interest in the auto manufacturers' investment in this space. So GM have invested in Lyft over in North America. VW have invested in Get, and they're based in 4 or 5 different locations around the world. And various other manufacturers, Toyota have got a small investment in Uber, and so on and so forth. Apple, who I think everyone knows is interested in the auto space, have put a lot of money into Uber as well. So into Didi, I beg your pardon, which is a Chinese player. So a lot of interest from the auto manufacturers, and I think the driving rationale, as you touched on there, for them is that they're looking at the future of urban mobility and how people are going to move around cities in the future. And lots and lots of trends are pointing towards the fact that individual car ownership is declining, and particularly amongst younger generations. And they're looking in 10, 15 years' time, with the onset of autonomous vehicles, of a scenario where the person who owns the demand for that on-demand transportation will be in a very powerful position. And there was a world building up where people who could potentially own that demand, whether it was a MyTaxi, a Hailo, an Uber, or whoever, would be able to go and disintermediate in a way the car manufacturer between them and the end user. and that could put them into a place of being a commodity manufacturer, mass manufacturer for somebody else, and they'd lose that connection with the end user, they'd lose the visibility of their brand in the market, and so on and so forth. So fundamental threat to their business model, and so that's why you're seeing a lot of them take an active interest in this space.
Yeah, because it reminds me kind of, say, what's happened with iTunes, where iTunes in the music market, that Steve Jobs with his master play came in and said, you know what, you're not really making anything from digital music, piracy's a mess, we're going to clean that up for you, and we're going to become that intermediary, and by the way, you're going to pay us a commission. What that did for them was they lost the touch point with their end user, and they lost the relationship with that user. And in today's business world, the brand needs to have that touch point and needs to mean something to that public. And that's why this play makes absolute sense, and I think it's a master play.
Yeah, it's. I mean, that's a good analogy. One of the car manufacturers' executives has said to me in the past, has said, okay, well, think about other forms of transport. Think about planes or trains. When was the last time you went on a plane and train and thought who manufactured that plane or train? Occasionally, plane geeks might think about, well, it's a Boeing or it's an Airbus, but fundamentally, you think about the brand that's on the exterior of the piece of transport. So, they look at it and say that could be our future, and that's not a great place for them to be as a commoditized manufacturer. So they're taking steps to mitigate that.
And then it becomes about your brand experience thereafter, and all the work that comes throughout that. And it probably takes away the element, I suppose, that you in the early days you certainly would have dealt with, and certainly competitors would have dealt with regulation. It probably takes that off the table a little bit.
No, I mean, that's a very real factor in our business, and I think will continue to be, especially in the European sphere. So there are some markets which are much looser regulatory environment than it is the case in Europe. And even in Europe, we've got huge divergence, not just on a national level, but on a city-by-city level as well. So, and there's reasons why we have regulations, and over time, different cities decide different things about how they want the city to operate. Do they want fully accessible vehicles? Do they want to manage congestion? Do they want to have a high level of safety and security in what is a part of the public transport infrastructure? So there's lots of questions that city authorities are now effectively having to face all over again as this new model comes in, and decide where's the right place to draw that line. And we're seeing cities like London who've taken one route, and other cities that have taken a much more hard-nosed route, and so we're almost seeing like experiments played out in front of us, which is interesting. But I think that will remain a very key part of this industry's development for quite a long time, especially in the European space.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it puts Hailo, or MyTaxi, should I say, in a much stronger position in Europe, because I find certainly that a lot of US companies treat Europe like it's a country, while it's so fragmented, it has all the language fragmentation, and Hailo will now, through the merger with MyTaxi, actually has, you can actually act local and be global in the same way, because you have that understanding and you've built it organically, and it's not just suddenly bought in, or it's trying to put a new culture on from a US or China or whatever. That's a huge advantage.
Yeah, and I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head with that. And if you look at who our longer term competitors are going to be, there are some, they're very well run, very well capitalized, very savvy businesses that are coming into our market. And if we went just toe to toe with them and just say, right, we're going to be a European company that is one size fits all across Europe, and we're going to deal with Barcelona the same way as we deal with Dublin, the same way as we deal with London, we'd lose pretty quickly, because all of the other elements would then come into play, where we're not necessarily going to be able to compete with an Uber that has 10 billion of cash sitting on its balance sheet. So what we've got to do is, rather like the scenario in China where Didi and Uber fought toe to toe, and ultimately Didi won because it understood the environment a little bit better and had some certain environmental advantages. And that's very much the approach that we've got to take, is adapting a centralized model that's efficient, but with enough flexibility that it feels adapted to the local environment.
Yeah, and you can see the huge amount of work that is for you. Coming in as CEO, to meet all those different markets, because they all need to be treated differently. The cultures in those different countries all need to be treated differently. So it's a big task ahead, and we wish you the very best with that.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, your own home market in Dublin, I think, is a good example of the sort of model that we really want to employ, where we give the local team quite a lot of flexibility. I mean, they've obviously got the core tools of the technology and the capability, but there's a little bit of adaptation of the product. But then quite a lot of flexibility in the local marketing tone of voice, approach to that environment, so that hopefully you would back up the thought that it feels more homegrown than it is something that's run centrally, and that's really the model that we've got to now employ around about 50 cities rather than a handful.
Yeah, and then just from an operational perspective, I mean, it means you've merged. You've overlapped teams now, so it means actually economies of scope and scale. But stuff like your mapping, work like that's so key to the future. Working like that, and I suppose strengthening the teams by putting them together, means that you can look at other business opportunities and other business models to use your distribution pipeline more effectively as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we've got quite a lot of work ahead of us in the next few months, just to collapse the two businesses together and take advantages of those synergies and put the two teams together and get the best of both worlds, and all the usual things that you'd look to do as you pull two businesses together. Once we're through that, I think we've got a really powerful platform to work from that has lots of opportunity that is perhaps not fully explored at the moment. We're very much just very focused on our core business, but I think there are plenty of other opportunities we can exploit.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating journey so far, and we wish you the very best with it in the future, Andrew. Andrew Pinnington, CEO of Hailo. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Ed.
So now in the Innovation Show, we welcome Laurie Winkless, author and physicist, and author of the great new book, Science and the City. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Aidan. Lovely to be here.
So let's jump straight into the book and talk about your mindset writing the book and what you wanted to portray, etc.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I guess it's important to say I live in London, which means that I'm a bit obsessed by transport, like all Londoners. Getting from A to B is always the focus of your day, unfortunately. So I kind of had a real interest in transport just as an everyday person. But my research background is in material science. So I worked in the National Physical Laboratory for 7 or 8 years working on materials. So that tends to be a very applied area of research. It's very hands-on, very practical, always looking for applications in the real world.
What is that? What is material science?
So my area, so material science is anything to do with, it's kind of chemistry and physics overlapping, to be honest. So my own research area was on materials that are called thermoelectrics, and they can turn waste heat into electricity without any moving parts. So the last project that I worked on before I left the lab was with a big European collaboration which was focused on the car industry, trying to capture some of the waste heat in a car exhaust and use that to produce electricity to recharge the batteries in a car. So it very, very applied, but in terms of the discipline, it's kind of chemistry and physics overlapping, understanding atoms in a material, everything from subatomic stuff right up to skyscrapers.
Yeah, and apart from your academics, you've had the benefit of having the great Barry Winkless, who's a regular contributor on this show, as a brother and obviously Chief Imagination Officer in Catawave. Yeah,
my big bro. We're best friends as well as siblings, which is really lovely. And I'm next to Barry in age, so he's one older than me, as it were. Yeah. So he had a big influence on my love of learning. I think I came out interested in stuff, but Barry really encouraged it.
Yeah, he's like, put down that doll and read this, goddamn.
Yeah, well, this is it. Like Barry will tell you, like I would, as a toddler, I was lying on the ground with newspapers teaching myself how to read, and he always encouraged it.
Brilliant. So, I mean, you've kind of a nice little melting pot of influences.
Yeah,
and what other influences came for the book?
I think as well, and I guess this is true for most city dwellers, you sometimes find yourself asking questions about how the city works. Like, if you push a button on a pedestrian crossing, what does it actually do? And some of the answers I kind of knew, and if friends asked me, I could answer, but some of the answers I didn't know myself. So a lot of it was just a kind of a curiosity that built up from living in a city. And I thought, well, if I don't know how a lot of the city works, then probably lots of other people have no idea at all. We know those with no science background might never even think about it.
But before you even started studying, were you asking these as a kid? What were you like?
Yeah, very curious. Like,
what's that, Daddy? What's that?
Yeah, constantly. Like, my dad's a retired engineer as well.
Right.
So he wasn't retired when I was a kid, of course, but so he would always encourage me to take part in DIY stuff. So I'm quite good at my hands. I'm quite
Brilliant.
practical. And my mum was just a huge fan of my love of reading. So I would go to the library all the time because I'd always want to find out the answers myself.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So it was kind of a very curious kid anyway. And I knew from a very early stage, well, I don't know if this is true, but my mum tells the story that when I was 4 or 5, we were in Dublin, because I'm from Dundalk originally, and we were in Dublin for the day, and I was walking past Trinity, and I said, "What's that?" And she said, "Oh, it's a school, you have to work very hard to get there." And I said, "I'm going to go to that school one day."
Brilliant.
So yeah, I ended up studying physics at Trinity.
Okay. So you said it in stone to
Apparently.
Yeah. let's keep it. Let's keep
yeah. I like it.
So, and then, like, I mean, as a kid in school, were you bored?
No, not really. I mean, I'm just, I've always been a bit of a sponge, so I like to learn. And I've been very lucky with some of the teachers I've had.
Okay.
They've been very enthusiastic and very encouraging of my slightly niggling personality, you know, where I just keep asking questions. So yeah, I had a real overlap within my interests. So I had an interest in physics and science, but I also love to read, and I have kept a diary since I was a really small kid. So the interest in science and writing, even when I was applying for university, was still kind of, well, should I do like journalism or should I do physics? And my dad, you know, we talked about it a lot. I talked about it with my family a lot about what I should do. And I remember distinctly my dad saying, you know, if you can try and do journalism as a hobby, you can write in your spare time. It's very hard to do science in your spare time. So I kind of, you know, wanted to study physics. And now I'm very lucky that I get to combine my love of writing and my love of reading that's always been there, separate from science, with my research background and my interest in science. So I feel very privileged that I'm in that position. Yeah.
But it's so apparent to me doing this show that, you know, most entrepreneurs I've met here have had a vast experience. So they're almost generalists, specialists within the general type of mindset. So they've done several different things and married different disciplines together, and that's when the magic happens. Yeah. Well,
I've been asked before, like, to describe my career path, and I tend to say that it's like leaping from one lily pad to another, but it's kind of all in the same pond.
Yeah. But anyway, let's dive into the book. Yeah. So the traffic one's an interesting one. The kind of transport thing is really interesting because one of the things I didn't realise is that when you're trying to move traffic around a city, you know, we all get really impatient and we sit in traffic a lot, or we sit at traffic lights and we hit every red light as we drive through a city. But actually, it's what's called an intractable problem. So in theory, there is a perfect solution to free-flowing traffic. But in reality, it takes such a long time to compute that perfect solution that it's not practical. So it's always going to be a compromise. So moving traffic through cities when you have many, many junctions that are intersecting each other, it's impossible for it to flow freely all the time. And that's kind of part of it being a human city, of course, too, because we don't just have road vehicles, we have pedestrians and cyclists and everything. But that was something I hadn't really thought about, was the maths behind traffic jams. And there's a huge amount in it. Like, one thing that's quite interesting is that actually you don't kind of drive into a traffic jam hits you. So, and a lot of it is to do with how we drive. Humans are very bad at staying at a constant speed. You pretty much need to be like a fighter pilot to be really good at staying at the
those
pressure
speeds.
of the pedal.
Yeah. And I think it's partly like if someone's driving ahead of you and they brake, you brake as well, of course, but sometimes you overbrake. So you overcompensate for them braking to give yourself some more headroom. And then the person behind you brakes slightly more than that, and so on through the chain. So you get this wave of traffic, and the actual physical term for it is a jamaton, which I quite love.
Nice.
And then there's a secondary wave, which is the one much further down, these kind of phantom traffic jams that we come across. They're called jamatinos.
Nice.
So there's a huge amount of maths just within moving
and
traffic.
it's hidden to us, you know.
Absolutely. And hidden even to those who are really, really curious naturally, you just don't really think about it.
Yeah.
But within, like, as we look forward to the future cities, and that's something the book looks into a lot, in each chapter, I try to look at the technology, realistic technology that's being developed now that's going to influence the cities tomorrow. We're starting to see a much smarter use of that data. So within London, for example, I interviewed the Transport for London, the roads guys. So basically the guys who run all of the traffic lights in London. And you can imagine it was like a nerve centre. It was incredible, all this data coming in from everywhere. And they're starting to use that in a way to change the traffic system. So, for example, they're putting sensors on buses that detect how many people are on the bus. So then if the bus is full, they'll try to give a bus priority over, a row of single cars, because you've many more people to move through.
I've seen that with the traffic lights, yeah.
And it's so interesting.
Yeah.
And longer term as well, they want to give cyclists a proper head start. So they're starting to install cyclist specific lights, which they have in Amsterdam, of course, that has a thermal camera on it, and it detects how many cyclists. So you can't see anyone's features or anything. It's completely anonymized, but you can see how many cyclists are in a box.
Yeah.
And once there's a certain number,
Wow.
they'll switch the cyclist light on quicker
Fantastic.
than the traffic. Yeah, so it's kind of, but it is always a compromise, and it is always trying to balance all of the needs of the city.
It reminds me of an automated Operation Free Flow. Do you remember that in Ireland a few years back?
Yeah, and then going forward, you've maybe driverless cars, right? And maybe that will change things again.
Because I thought when you were saying about keeping at the constant speed, I mean, that's what the driverless cars. I thought about this one for you. Driverless cars it's going to happen, but is it only really effective when everybody's driverless?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because actually, to be honest, the issue with driverless cars is not the technology. The technology is there. It's expensive, but it's there. The real challenges, I guess, with driverless cars are the logistics and the legal issues and the moral issues. So we as humans are excellent at using our judgment. So if we drive up to a junction and the traffic light has broken down or something, or there's graffiti over a road sign, we can use our prior knowledge and our experience to drive very carefully through that junction. So we are masters of grey. We're the masters of the grey of the human condition. Whereas computers, by their very nature, so far, are black and white. It's a binary system. It's ones and zeros. There's no superposition of ones and zeros at the moment. So when you have a situation where, like that, if there's a broken down traffic light, a driverless car doesn't necessarily have the ability to make the correct decision there, because they aren't self-learning. They only know what we teach them. So those kind of situations are very difficult to model for.
It's stuff like, and you've seen it, unfortunately, it's happened where somebody will push a buggy out in the road in front of them.
Absolutely.
And, what does the car do? Because
Exactly.
it's gone, well, I have to avoid that other car.
Exactly.
And that car speaks my language, ones and zeros.
Yeah.
The grey doesn't. I don't do grey.
No, but that's exactly it. And that is the biggest challenge. Like, really, I mean, it's so when we have a mixture of cars on the road, when we have human driven cars and driverless cars, that's when we're going to see the biggest problems.
Challenge,
because it's still so early for us, and both systems, the black and white and the grey, have great value in them, but actually getting them to overlap and cooperate and collaborate is a very new concept for us. But we as city dwellers, we might not necessarily like being in tunnels, but we've kind of gotten used to it because it's part of the urban structure. So maybe it is something we'll get used to, but certainly, the technology is not what's stopping it from happening. And I'm very cautious. Like, as a physicist, I'm very cautious about things anyway. And we don't like predicting the future because you're always wrong. But I think it's a bit further down the road than a lot of the media would have you believe.
And it's funny you say about the technology and the people, because I have a saying that it's never about, digital transformation is never about the ones and zeros. It's about the X's and Y's. It's
Absolutely.
about, because you have to.
It's a really good description.
It's because, that's what you have to change. It's changing legacy mindsets, culture, acceptance of, and another thing you just said there was that you can't predict the future because you're always wrong. And, people are being held to ransom to go, oh, but you said in your business plan.
Yeah.
And you can go, well, business plans are, in this world of disruption and constant change, a business plan isn't worth very much.
Exactly.
It's a guess.
Nothing exists in a vacuum, right? We're all connected. And that was part of one of the other reasons that I wanted to focus on cities, because I felt like they were a real kind of like a mini version of the issues we have wider across the world. each city has exactly the same challenges that we're all facing across the globe, in terms of water security, in terms of electricity. And like you said, one of the things is getting people to change their behaviour, because we're spoiled rotten. We're in this situation where we expect to have this electricity, especially in developed countries and developed cities, wealthy cities. We don't want to adjust in order to find more sustainable solutions. And that's a real challenge. And especially with things like water, it's urgent. It's beyond urgent at this point that we need to change our behaviour to the way that we use water and reuse water, because it is gone so far beyond unsustainable that it's actually slightly terrifying.
Yeah, and it kind of, that reminds me of kind of, people talk about digital natives, people born into that world, and it's kind of like what we're talking about, transport and roads. At the time that they were built for. Yeah. People are just born into when they're born into. Absolutely. Like, they've no concept of the world before mobile phone. My son's 6 and 3. No concept of the world before mobile phone or iPad or touchable screens. Transport is a focus. What else do you talk about in the book?
So I talk about electricity as well, because I think that's another one of our big challenges, and every city's doing it differently. So a lot of cities, in China in particular, most of their electricity grid is still coal fired, so it's mostly based on coal. So therefore, kind of dirty, for inverted commas, because it's producing a lot of greenhouse gases. In other cities and in other countries, there's a real move towards renewables. In some regions, it's kind of amazing how much of their grid is based on renewables, because actually the logistics of getting electricity, which is by its very nature a constant need, right? We have a constant need for electricity, but wind turbines and solar panels, they don't produce electricity constantly. So getting a grid set up so that it's ready for that, so it's ready for this kind of intermittent electricity, but also can balance with demand from consumers. It's really, really tricky. And I wondered if kind of the grid is on its way out as we know it, the kind of national grid as we know it. And a lot of the people I interviewed feel very strongly that it is, that we're going to start to move away from this kind of centralised grid that we all plug into, and more towards district and city level distribution networks. So perhaps, if you live on the coast, you as a city will invest in a bank of wind turbines off the coast, and instead of just using the electricity as it's produced, you'll store it locally and then distribute it locally, and that's a much more sustainable way of doing it. It's also a much more realistic way of getting as much renewable energy as we possibly can into the grid, because whether we like it or not, fossil fuels are not going to last forever. We have far too much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere as it is, and we are continuing to pump more of it into the atmosphere. So we need to get out of that mindset. And we're seeing cities that are starting to push with that, not just countrywide governments, like local authorities are really, really starting to be very innovative about how they use electricity. So that's in the book a lot as well. That's
really interesting, because that kind of mirrors what happens in innovation within a company. It takes a little pocket of innovation to start, and because you can't change the whole thing straight away, you have to change I often think of the Titanic, and you're kind of going room by room, compartment by compartment, we'll change this. And that's the only, and it's really interesting because we also live in a world of personalization, and it's kind of going, it's not personalizing just for me, it's personalizing for the context around me, so my location, etc. And what you said there about, if I live in an area that has high wind, then that's my, I adapt to that, and that's my energy source. Because I saw my son Josh is big into science, and he was watching a science program the other day, and it was talking about the cliffs of Moher, and the energy produced from the waves there that's untapped, and obviously the challenge is tapping that energy, but that it could power London for like a week or something.
Well, I mean, Scotland's a great example, because Scotland, like if we look at them, because they've got a similar wind pattern to us, they've got similar tidal patterns to us as well, but Scotland they've invested hugely in wind turbines in particular. They do have some of these kind of undersea turbines as well that we could use off the west coast of Ireland for sure. But there've been several days, many days, several weekends, week-long periods in Scotland where they've gotten all of their electricity from wind power. The same is true in Scandinavian countries too. They are getting the vast majority of their electricity from the wind now. So it is starting to happen, but those technologies, there's an impression that those technologies are very expensive and very costly. But actually, I've found quite a few research papers and spoke to lots of researchers who have shown that, in fact, those technologies, the return you get on your investment is much, much higher than on the non-renewable technologies. And in fact, they start to make profit much earlier as well. So cities are now starting to realise there's a financial benefit as well as an environmental benefit to investing in these technologies on a local level.
It's funny because, again, it's and Barry talks about this, is you need a carrot, and often that carrot's a financial one, because people won't invest in their future because they're so caught up with dealing with today and the challenges of today. And also, with so much disruption in the world, their margins are being chipped down, everything's being chipped away, and they're kind of going, well, I can't focus on the future because I can't afford to.
Exactly.
But if you don't, there's a storm coming. It's it's like fossil fuels, they're running out.
Yeah.
Your business is going to run out, and some startup's going to go and do it. And you need that mindset of I need a startup within the big corporation or the big organization who runs on a different operating system, who creates a different future or several different futures.
Well, this is it. And like one of the really interesting projects I came across, which kind of looked at that, had that kind of idea, that mentality. So hydrogen fuel cell cars have been talked about for a long time. There's actually lots of car manufacturers who are now producing commercial, ready-to-go cars that are run on fossil fuel, or are run on fuel cells, I should say. So they use hydrogen gas in a tank, just like your petrol or your diesel tank. And they combine that with oxygen from the air, which the engine sucks in from the air. And by combining them in a particular way with lots and lots of chemistry involved, you produce electricity and water vapour as the only emission, right? So obviously very attractive from an environmental point of view. You're just putting water back into the atmosphere instead of all these horrible nitrogen and sulfur dioxides, which are very dangerous to us. But they haven't really made sense for a long time. Doesn't mean, of course, people haven't been researching them, but there's always been this gap, And now we're starting to see companies who are, and it kind of comes back to the wind turbine thing, who are starting to tap into that wasted energy that is being produced by wind turbines to produce hydrogen gas. So hydrogen gas in itself is very expensive to produce because you have to split water apart, basically. And that takes a lot of electricity. So that's why it's never really made sense. It's like, oh, we'll just use loads of electricity to produce this fuel that's clean. Well, it kind of doesn't make sense. But yeah, so because your grid, any national grid, has a limit as to how much wind power it can cope with, sometimes you'll see turbines that are not moving when it's windy because they've had to be turned off because the grid can't cope with the electricity they're producing. So companies are now setting themselves up to tap into that wasted energy. So when the grid is full, as it were, when the grid has all the wind it can get, they're using that electricity and pumping it into a hydrogen production plant, and they're using it to produce hydrogen gas for fuel cell cars, which then don't produce any fossil fuels. So we're starting to see these companies now that are filling those gaps. So there's been lots of very futuristic research that's been looking forward all the time. That's what science is. It's always about looking at the next thing. And now you're starting to see companies who are realising that they can actually join the needs of today with the needs of tomorrow.
Yeah, and just listening to you and thinking about the book, when I met Colm Lyon, who's founder of Pay With Fire, he told me that what he did for his staff was, he said he bought them all PSD2 in plain English, which is a book by Paul Rowan, who's also on the show. And it appeals to me that this book is a book that's necessary for anybody interested in smart technology, smart cities, and anybody who's thinking of a foray into that world or has a product that might fit into that world, because it'll give them a landscape view of what's opportunities are there. I
think so. I mean, I kind of see it as a primer as to how cities work, and also because I've spoken to lots of people who are right at the cutting edge of what's going to change tomorrow. I think it's given people a bit of an idea of maybe I could actually play a part in the city of tomorrow.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful cover and it's a beautiful book, I have to say. Bloomsbury Press have done a great job on that. I know you probably have been through several iterations of the cover, but you've done a really good job. So Laurie Winkless, author of Science in the City, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Aidan.
So welcome to the show, Gearoid Mooney, Division Manager of Research and Innovation for Enterprise Ireland.
Thanks, Aidan, and apologies, that's a bit of a mouthful.
But you've had, speaking of mouthfuls, an unbelievable career. You've been in the ICT and commercialisation of ICT sector for a very long time. Could you give us a quick recap of your career since you left college?
long time. Actually, I went to NIHE Dublin, or DCU as it was known, and I was in the first year of intake. So already I think we're showing a bit of the challenge, try something new. When I got out, went straight into a startup company with a bunch of others called Kestrel Security Systems. I had an amazing 5 years there with them, and then decided I'd try something new again. So went back and joined a spin-out company out of DCU, and tried that for another 3-4 years. That took me up to about 1990 when things were tough. But what I really wanted to do is I wanted to learn for myself, how the business side of things worked, because I had been the R&D manager. So I decided to join public sector here, OLIS, the Irish Science and Technology Agency. And the original plan was spend 2 years, learn everything I could about companies, about the business aspects of commercialization, and move on. I never did.
Yeah.
The career, everything changed constantly, kept me really, really interested and engaged, and I've never looked back since.
So that's really interesting that you went, I have this skill, so the R&D and innovation skill that you picked up, and by actually getting your hands dirty, it wasn't theoretical.
Yeah. No, it was actually real products to real people. Yeah.
We see this time and time again from people we've talked to on the show. It's the only way to learn, whether it's digital marketing, whether it's R&D, whether it's innovation. Get your hands dirty and actually feel what it's like to walk in the shoes of that role.
Absolutely.
But then you learned the commercialization side to add those skills together, and that's really where you've excelled in your career, ICT and the commercialization of ICT.
Correct. And that first job was all about finding technology partners for Irish companies in Europe. So getting a good spec, understanding what the Irish company wanted, and then trying to reach out and find opportunities to fulfill that around Europe. So that was the start of it.
Yeah, so it's funny because I've read about some really successful entrepreneurs, and instead of reading books and newspaper articles, what they read is actually the financial reports of companies to really understand what makes companies tick. And I'm sure from your research and looking for partners, in a way you're looking at that, you're looking at how does the business plan work?
Correct.
And it's almost like a matchmaking service.
Correct.
Like an old Irish matchmaker, then Kerry.
Absolutely. I suppose with the added twist of when you're actually looking for a partner, or partners for a company, you've got to hit them at exactly the right time they have a need, particularly for small enterprise. You've got to actually find what it is they're looking for at the time they know they want it, because just bringing them stuff on a random basis probably doesn't really take,
And probably confuse them as well.
Correct.
As in, like, they're trying to work on a plan, and then there's this guy coming in. And how do you identify those opportunities, Gearoid?
At this stage in my career, one of the primary areas I look into is actually the third level research system here and overseas. But primarily here, because there's quite a large state investment been made in the research system over the last 10 to 15 years, and everybody wants to see the maximum impact from that. So that would be a really good starting point for me. And there's a huge amount of opportunity there. The research system with that spend has attracted an awful lot of talent, and there's some really, really good people. And for an SME, sometimes if you're working on a problem and you need a specific piece of talent, but actually you need it to solve the problem, you don't necessarily need to hire it and keep it forever. It gives you that opportunity to build your dream team around what you're trying to solve, and then when it's done and solved, you just move on with the business.
That's really interesting, because we talked to Kingsley Aikens on the show a few weeks ago, and he talked about this notion that the world is going to go to these kind of contract-based employment where you're brought in for a project, you complete that project, and then you're on to the next project. So that totally fits what you're saying.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of willing collaborators within the research system now as well, which maybe 10, 15 years ago we just didn't have that much of,
Yeah, and just to come back to your career, so with your career, you end up in OLIS, but then OLIS dramatically changed, and eventually parts of OLIS became
Correct.
Enterprise Ireland now.
Correct.
Can we talk about that for a second? What happened with Enterprise Ireland, how it came about?
Sure. Well, it came out of a national policy. So I suppose I've always been interested in making sure the voice of the customer is heard in everything I do. But as an agency, the voice of the customer spoke. So there was both the Culleton report followed on by getting ahead of the curve with O'Driscoll, who decided that Ireland was good at certain things at that point in time, very good at attracting foreign direct investment. but actually maybe looking after homegrown industry weren't so good, and that kind of big grant approach wouldn't work to help young companies get started. Probably wouldn't work because the biggest thing a young company starting faces is cash flow. And the old grant system works well if you spend something and you claim it back. Most young startups don't have that kind of time or runway. So there was an attempt made to set up an agency specifically to develop its own tools, and that would really, really encourage homegrown industry to grow and scale here.
Yeah, and we've heard Enterprise Ireland. When we talk to startups as part of the show, they all mention Enterprise Ireland as being instrumental in their career, in their starting and getting them the Kickstarter, essentially.
Yeah.
How does that work for companies? Like, just for companies who are listening, or somebody who has the bud of an idea, how does Enterprise Ireland help?
Okay, so there's funding is a really key part of it, and we've got funding offers on a number of levels. So we've got competitive start. So for those who are early and trying to figure out what their offer looks like, and that 50k would take them a long way towards helping them to figure that out. We have a competitive scheme for that where people can apply and get up to 50k of investment up front. Then for those companies who have figured out who their other investors are going to be, but could do with that piece from the state to help de-risk the project, then we've got an offer under our high potential startup offer, which is anywhere, typical investment is maybe 250 to 300k to help the company get started. But all the way through that process, we're looking at strengthening the business plan, making sure the company has the right product market fit, helping them understand that they're hearing the voice of their customer in building out what they're building, and hopefully de-risking the project then for everybody. You
know, it's something we talked about, that aspect of mentorship, essentially, or coaching.
Yes.
So the business coaching and your own knowledge of studying the commercialization part by getting your hands dirty, as well as the ICT and innovation. Yeah. And putting those together. And we've had some great examples of that in Ireland, spin-outs of companies where a company was set up essentially through funding, perhaps in a college, and then businesses come in and mentor them to spin out. Can you give us some examples of that? Sure.
I have two kind of key examples. One ICT, one not. One in the drug discovery aspirin area. So there's a spin-out company from Trinity, or company looking to spin out, called Solvatrin. And an entrepreneur, I think he was either a finalist or a winner of the Ernst & Young competition at one point. He came to us and said, I'm interested in other ideas. He knew a lot about another industry, not drug discovery, but he's an entrepreneur and he was really, really well connected. And the bits he didn't know, he could easily put his hand on the people that could, and managed to bring that all together with the smarts out of Trinity to form this company called Solvatrin, which is up and running now. Another really, really good example would have been the Feed Henry spin out of Waterford, which had a really, really good exit about in 2014. But the way that happened was they had some great tech they had developed using European funding from way back. We added in some commercialization funding to de-risk it a little bit further. But the piece they were missing was a leader, an entrepreneur who really could put the business case around it. So we all got lucky. We introduced them to Cathal Madloin, and Cathal came in and within months made a huge difference to the company and their future direction, and set it up to be the success that it was. Yeah, it's really a case of bringing somebody to work on the business while everybody else works in the business. Correct. And that experience, I suppose, of how to rapidly present it, etc., and put your elevator pitch together. Yeah. But what's really interesting is, from what you're saying, is there's a huge opportunity for traditional businesses, or even a fledgling business, to look for partnerships outside the business, and be that with college, be that with the colleges or universities, or be that with another industry. Yeah. Can we talk about that and how you see that evolving? Sure. I think at its most basic level that even if Ireland is the best country in the world, but even if we were absolutely top of the business league, we can't invent everything. So no matter how good your business is, there's always something out there. There's always added knowledge that you can tap into. So on a notional basis, that would seem to work, or on an emotional basis. But what we've noticed in Enterprise Ireland over the last number of years, by looking at the the spend and the success of companies is that the companies who invest in innovation and research, new products, new processes, new services, have weathered and thrived during deep downturns and continue to outperform those that don't invest in those things. But more recently, what we found out on top of that was not only did they do really well if they invested in R&D, but if they also collaborated as well as investing in their own R&D, that there were 35% higher in terms of employment over the same period as those that didn't, and an order of magnitude bigger in terms of export sales than those that didn't. Now, can you put it all down to the investment because those are really, really good companies? I would say no, but it's a strong characteristic of the ones that survive and thrive. So that collaboration piece would seem, based on the evidence we have, to add a huge amount to the business development of a company.
So there's two distinct sectors there. There's the innovation piece, so that's actually having a team or even like a part-time team who are focused on where the company's going or what opportunities are there for the company. But then there's a totally different piece, and it could be the same team, who are looking to collaborate with others to build a new product or build a new service in some way. Yeah. And how like, so what we see oftentimes is companies are under financial stress. Mm-hmm. They're looking at their bottom line and they go, you know what, I don't need an R&D department. And we saw a lot of this happen during the recessions where people just got rid of the R&D department. And then these new roles of innovation kind of came up and it was replaced with innovation labs or innovation hubs, essentially. But what's your advice to those companies? I mean, there's empirical evidence there. Yeah. And I mean, that's the big challenge is how can I prove to you with a business plan what the future is? Yeah.
I would say that all of our companies during the tough period in the recession leaned out. But those that still managed to maintain a core function, who, in spite of the urgent, still managed to keep focused on the important, have shown us in hard numbers that they did better than the ones who cut back too far or who made no investment in R&D and innovation over that time. So the evidence, the hard evidence is there. So it's definitely worth it. Not only that, but within the next 6 weeks or so, the government, or the parent department of Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation will be publishing a national study further reinforcing with hard numbers that the investment in innovation is worth it, even in tough times.
Okay, well, we'll definitely be sharing that from the show's Twitter account. But one last question, Gearoid, is where can people find out more information?
Okay.
So both startups, but also businesses looking for partners.
Okay. So in terms of startups, I would have to direct them to the Enterprise Ireland website, which is constantly under revision with new content and new offers or recast offers that as time evolves, so do companies, so do needs, and we try to evolve our offers to go with them. On the partnering side, if you're really interested in exploring for yourself some of the opportunities around the third level and getting value out of the research system here, there's a fabulous website called knowledgetransferireland.ie, which has listings of all the research groups, searchable databases on researchers and what their areas of interest are, sample agreements to cover partnering agreements, and lovely examples there of people who've done it before and what they have gotten out of it. So I would highly recommend it if you want to do a little bit of self-education, just to explore it a bit, that website is a huge resource. The second website, I think, because we can't ignore the offer from Europe under the Horizon 2020 scheme, which is the biggest research and innovation fund on the planet right now. And Ireland is determined to make sure it makes best use of that money coming in. But we have horizon2020.ie, which will show you the national support team and who to actually pick up the phone to talk about your specific business and what the opportunities would be. And also, just on the Horizon 2020, there is a specific scheme in there for SMEs, particularly those who are doing really, really interesting things on the technology front.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because a lot of people, when I talk to them about Horizon 2020 and tell them about it, because some don't know, they think it's a university grant or they think it's unreachable. But you said it's available for companies, it's available
Absolutely.
for SMEs, and there's actually specific funds to help SMEs
Correct.
accelerate.
Correct. So, in terms of the overall company participation, about 30% of Ireland's win under Horizon 2020 currently goes to companies and mostly SMEs. And we're kind of, at the moment, the number one SME participant in Horizon 2020 in Europe. But then also there is the SME instrument, which can put feasibility amounts of money into interesting tech companies of about 50k as a grant. And can also go over $1 million in grants for those that they feel that are truly disruptive and will really bring Europe along and that Europe should be investing in. And so far, in the last 18 months, 15 Irish companies have gotten $1 million plus out of that particular scheme.
So it's delivering.
It's delivering, yeah.
Gearoid Mooney, Division Manager for Research and Innovation for Enterprise Ireland. Thank you for coming in to us.
You're welcome.